The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, a look at what Donald Trump's tariff threat means for Canada. Then, what can be done to address the record-high youth unemployment rate? That's next on The Agenda. Before entering the White House, U.S. President-elect Donald Trump announced that he would sign an executive order imposing a 25% tariff on all products coming into the United States from Canada and Mexico. Should we take him at his word, or is this a bluff to get something else? Let's find out from Giles Gerson. He's President and CEO of the Toronto Region Board of Trade. Mark Warner, Canadian and American trade lawyer with Maw Law. And Deanna Horton, Distinguished Fellow at the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. And it's great to welcome the three of you back to our studio here today. I just wonder, Deanna, start us off. How should we be reacting to Trump's latest broadside?
I think we should be trying to step back and take the long view. I think we need to be prepared, but we also have to recognize that just based on the previous administration, that there's a lot of back and forth and there's a lot of posturing. But I think the trends that have been between Canada and the U.S. and the U.S. kind of working more towards an industrial policy, protectionist, and the impact of trade agreements in general, that's a long-term trend. And that's what we need to prepare for. When
you say the previous administration, do you mean Biden or Trump won?
Trump won.
Trump won. Gotcha. Mark, your view.
I mean, similar to that, I think you've got to take him seriously. I think the current threat isn't just directed at Canada and Mexico. I think it's a message to the world. And so part of responding to this, I think Canada has to realize that, because if you're responding to everything he does as if it's a nuclear DEFCON 1 or whatever it is, there'll be another one coming down next week because he's trying to send a message to others to have negotiated with him. So I think, I think we go from that. I mean, I think also the thing about Trump that I think we learned from Trump 1 is that he does bluster, he does make threats, and there is some negotiating. He is a transactional person, but he's also, when he's backed into a corner, he'll punch back very hard and punch his way out of the corner. And sort of in responding to him, you've got to figure out how not to react like your hair's on fire, but you've also got to react in a way that you don't sort of put him in the corner that he then says, oh, you don't think I'll do this? Well, then I'll do it just for fun.
You got to leave it out.
You got to leave it out.
Giles.
Well, yeah, it may well be that our hair isn't on fire yet, but it could be, on January 20th or just after that. I think you have to, as both are saying, I think we have to take this very seriously. We had 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum back in 2018. It lasted a year. It's devastating for our steel sector. So we've been through that. We know what it's like. I don't think we can afford to go through it again. I'd also point out we're somewhat weaker as an economy than we were 6 years ago. Our economy's been in a bit of a tailspin. If you look at GDP per capita, our wealth generally has been going down relative to the United States quite sharply. So we're in a weak position. So yeah, I think we have to bargain as strongly as we can. But we are dealing from a position of weakness, and I think we have to clear the decks and make sure these tariffs don't come on. They'll be devastating if they do.
Can you, I'd like Mark to follow up on that, really explain to people who may not know what tariffs are or what they do, if you put a 25% tariff on goods X, Y, and Z, it will do this to the price. As a result, it will have this effect on businesses in Canada.
Sure. I mean, the idea is basically if you start with a product that's worth $100 and you put 25% tariff on it, the cost of that product then goes up to $125. So it means that basically anything we're trying to sell into the United States that we were selling for 100 will now sell for 125, which will reduce American demand. Now, who pays for it? Economists can argue back and forth about it. It really depends on sort of the shape of the curves and things you learn in first-year economics. But for the most part, the people who are going to pay for it are going to be the consumers, so American consumers, unless Americans can ramp up production fast enough and replace the production.
Simplistic follow-up question. If that's what happens to the price when a 25% tariff gets put on it, Why can our businesses not simply say, that thing I used to sell for $100, I'm going to sell for $75, so when you tariff it at 25%, we're where we were?
We can, and that's what I was saying when you talk about the shape of the lines under the graph that you learn in first year economics. So, and that's what it is. Some businesses will be able to eat that, some won't, right? Some people won't be able to do that, and most won't if it's a competitive market. The idea that there'll be that much that you could shave off. So in some cases, it'll be the American importers, the person standing in between the consumer and the Canadian exporter. They'll say, well, I'll shave my margins because I want to preserve those relationships. And I think that's really how it works.
Is there any way we get away with 25% tariffs if they get imposed upon us? Is there any way we get away without a lot of the quite apocalyptic prognostications we've heard so far?
Well, I'd also like to take the view from the U.S. Don't forget that 25% is going to be 25% that the consumer is going to have to pay. So I was a NAFTA negotiator, and the idea was that, yes, we would have a free trade agreement and things would get cheaper. And then, of course, China got into the WTO. We've all been having a flood of Chinese products that are cheaper. But what is the American consumer going to say when the prices go up by 25%? So I would like to think that cooler heads will prevail and that it could be a selective. And this is where I think the U.S. is going anyway, that they're going to be looking at what is strategically important. And I think what Canada has to do is persuade the United States of our partnership. We have to demonstrate where we are in terms of our investment in the U.S., their dependence on us for oil and gas. Can you imagine putting a 25% tariff on oil and gas into the U.S.? That would be a problem.
They want our oil and gas.
One would think.
One would think.
Well, President Trump at last Friday's dinner with Prime Minister Trudeau talked about the Keystone XL being revived. So they want more of our oil and gas, it would appear. It's already over 30% of our exports to the U.S. is oil and gas. And so when President Trump talked about this massive trade deficit with Canada, you take oil and gas out of the picture, we're probably in a deficit position or in balance. So, on manufactured products, those kinds of things. So oil and gas is a really big factor. And I agree with Deanna. I think I'm sure they will exclude oil and gas, petroleum products from the mix. And I'm sure they'll exclude critical minerals from the mix. And there'll be other raw resources, perhaps, that they'll exclude, but that still leaves us with manufactured goods, which is for Ontario, a huge part of our trade.
But presumably these carve-outs don't just happen. We have to lobby like hell for them. Is that how it happens?
Absolutely.
You want to tell us about your experience with NAFTA and how the carve-outs take place?
Well, yes, and I think particularly for automotive, that is something where you have, and same with steel actually, you have a really integrated industry between the two countries. And that's where I think we have some bargaining power. But the really key element is to work on our U.S. allies, because it's not just the White House. It's in Congress, it's governors, it's all kinds of levels of government, and we have to ensure that our allies, because we have so many partners in the U.S. I worked on a map, this was several years ago, but showed all of the Ontario investments in the United States, over 11,000, something like that. It was pretty amazing. And when you are able to go to a congressman and say, here is where Canadian investment is in your district, that's what we need to do. We need to get industry in line. We need to get the politicians in line. The White House is only one of the decision makers in the United States.
Yeah, this is what worries me a little bit. I think I have a good sense of what Trump's going to do. I'm not too worried. I think there's a certain predictability to his unpredictability. Okay? It's the Canadian response that I worry about. I worry the Canadians believe what Deanna just said, to be very honest with you. I think if you look at the aluminum and steel tariffs, the Americans had concerns about Chinese imports coming to Canada, getting mixed with Canadian product. Canada negotiated too hard, and Trump turned around and said, okay, I'll put the tariffs in place and I'll find some archaic feature of my trade law to do it. A year later, Canada agreed to do what Trump wanted to do all along. The tariffs came off. I wonder if Trump is his last term, probably never run for anything again.
It's funny how you say probably.
Yeah, well, never, at least for certain. So at the end of the day, when I look at it, Steve, and I ask myself, look, this guy, given his personality, I don't think you can roll him the way we can roll Biden, right? You have Biden had this signature legislative initiative, the Inflation Reduction Act, half his cabinet down to Washington, and basically embarrassed the American president. I don't think we'll be able to do that. So I wonder, I worry sometimes we put too many eggs in this. We've got these allies down there and they can muscle over and tell the president, because I don't think Trump will tolerate that.
Well, having said that, the Premier of Ontario has a new ad out today which is going to remind all those senators, congressmen, governors that we are the number one trading partner for X number of American states.
17.
17 American states. Do you think that can succeed?
I think it has some merit. I think it's a useful strategy. I mean, the province has been out there. Premier Ford's been out there. His ministers have been out there talking to governors and senators for the last bunch of months because they worried this was coming our way, and so I think it has some. I think it gives you a certain amount of ballast. But the reality is, what Mark said is true. I think that President Trump seems determined to move forward with this unless he gets what he wants. And so you saw at the Friday, the Meatloaf Summit, we can call it perhaps, down in Mar-a-Lago, that a lot of topics were canvassed, right? Whether it was Arctic defense, whether it was the huge issue at the border, supposedly. I mean, certainly the Mexican border is a huge issue for migrants and synthetic drugs coming through. The Canadian border has been increasingly a problem, although it's nothing near the scale of the Mexican problem.
While you're on that, let's follow up with that, because I got some numbers here. Okay. President Trump, incoming President Trump, talked about drugs being a problem on the two borders. And let's just do a little comparison here. These are U.S. numbers here. The agency, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, they seized 19.5 kilograms of fentanyl from our border. 19.5 kilograms versus 9,570 from the southern border with Mexico. So why is he making such a big deal out of our border?
Well, I think there's been an increase, so they're watching that. I think the bigger issue is less the synthetic drugs and more the illegal migration. I think where you've seen, again, a substantial increase across the Canadian border. Now, that's gone down in the last couple of months, substantially. Actually, funnily enough, both Mexico and Canada. But I think that what we're going to have to look for is a bit of a grand bargain here, I think. And it's going to have to include trade, because clearly that's one of the biggest issues. And Deanna mentioned steel. We've already imposed a 25% tariff on Chinese steel, like 300 different categories of steel last October, when we imposed 100% tariff on Chinese EVs and batteries. And so we've followed U.S. trade policy quite closely.
Is it working?
Unlike anybody, well, it's only been in place for 2 months. But I think the Americans will have to acknowledge, unlike any other country, we have followed U.S. trade policy.
Let me ask about the value of the dollar, because we've been hearing, again, a lot of apocalyptic prognostications about what, if these tariffs go ahead, what will happen to our dollar. Let's say, for example, the dollar goes as low as 55 cents U.S., 50 cents U.S., which I hear. What does that do to us?
Oh, that harms us, there's no doubt. Although traditionally one always assumed that if the dollar were lower, that meant we could export more, but we import so much as well. The inputs. Just a couple of points on what Giles has just said, though. First of all, in Washington, when you say the word border, people automatically think southern border. And so we get caught up on border issues all the time, just for that reason. The second thing in a longer term, though, what I would worry about is what happens with the review of the NAFTA. And CUSMA or USMCA, whatever. USMCA, right.
When's that come? That's still a couple years away.
2026, but that is not that far away. And I think that it's going to be very important that we work to ensure that it continues as it is or is improved. But, we also have to prepare for the fact that it may not survive. And this is a this is a huge challenge going forward.
You heard Doug Ford say the other day that he thought it would be a better idea for us to go bilateral with the U.S. and just exclude Mexico.
Bad idea.
Bad idea?
Yeah. It's an asymmetrical relationship.
Us and them.
Us and the U.S. Therefore, having somebody else in the room, I think at least during the first negotiation, was very helpful.
Mark.
You know, from the way I look at this, more of a sort of historical perspective, that, you know, Canada never wanted Mexico at the table, right? The history of that is we did our first FTA, and we thought we had hit the jackpot, and then the Americans turned around immediately and started negotiating with Mexico, and Canada was like, what? And asked to get at the table. And pretty much every Canadian government ever since has looked for ways to get Mexico out. In fact, we tried to get Mexico out before they did their side agreement with the United States, and then we got added to came to the USMCA. So I'm not surprised by that. Ultimately, it's not a decision, in my view, that Canada has anything to do with Canada. I think it's easier for the Americans, would have so many problems around the world with Asia, with Europe and Latin America, further south. They don't have time to do two separate talks with Canada and Mexico. So it's an interesting conversation in Canada. It will, in my view, go absolutely nowhere.
So ultimately, it's going to be all three together.
It will be all three together.
But can I raise a point about that? I mean, one of the things that I think the Americans are very focused on in the CUSMA is backdoor. You know, is China or is Mexico or Canada a backdoor to Chinese product coming in? And it's quite clear that Mexico has been. If you look at autos, for example, it's rising rapidly. I think about 20% of their exports and cars to the United States are actually not duty-free. They're paying the tariff because they have Chinese inputs. And the reality is that 2.5% tariff into the U.S. is so nominal, so minimal, that it's worth doing. So Canada's got the same problem. Remember, we've got a massive trade deficit with Mexico. Right? We may be more or less in balance with the United States, absent oil and gas, but with Mexico, on a $3.8 billion two-way trade, they have a $3 billion surplus.
Here's the problem I have a little bit with that, makes me worry a little bit, is it's true, all of that's true to some extent, but you also have to look at who are the parts makers in Mexico. A lot of our we call them Canadian auto parts makers, are in Mexico. They're not bringing parts to Mexico from Canada. They're coming from China. The big win that Canada and Mexico had in the first dispute settlement case brought under USMCA was to do with rules of origins. And I've been saying for many years now, that case had nothing to do with Canada and Mexico. It was really about how much Chinese content you could have in a part that could still be called Mexican and Canadian. Canada and Mexico were very happy when they won it. Now Canada's trumpeting that we've harmonized our tariff rules to align with Americans on these 100% tariffs on electric vehicles. I haven't heard the Canadian government formally say they no longer agree with that dispute settlement case they want. So we kind of suck and blow on this stuff. One of the big cases, one of the big pieces of legislation in Congress right now has to do with something called the de minimis rule, an $800 rule that was highly contentious in the negotiation of the USMCA because the Americans wanted Canada and Mexico to raise our de minimis rules, which are considerably lower, to $800. What Americans will say is that the Chinese are coming on both sides of the border and setting up facilitation facilities which then sell product into the United States. So I don't believe that Canada will get away with this idea of saying they do it, but we don't. Look at them, don't look at us.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I think the elephant in the room is China. The issues that were brought up by the president-elect and the issues that I think the U.S. has been facing is also some of the issues that Canada faces. And I think it's going to be very important that Canada approach the U.S. In a way that will emphasize that we share concerns, we want to collaborate, and we also have to skip to defense, for example. We need to improve defense in the Arctic, which we are starting to do. But we have to do some things that will allow the U.S. to continue to play. We want the U.S. to continue to be the leader. And if it's not, then we are really in trouble. So we have to support them at the same time as we are fighting them on some fronts.
But Giles, if I understood what you said, we have to convince Trump that we're not going to be a backdoor for cheaper Chinese goods getting into the United States.
We've done it on steel, and we've done it on EVs. The question is what else? I mean, I think, and it's in our interest as much, frankly, as theirs. And so I think, I think the bargain, as Deanna says, will have to include the border. It'll have to include defense, but it'll also have to basically assure the Americans that we're not a backdoor. We won't be a backdoor, and that's maybe where the interest between Canada and Mexico may part, and we'll see about that. And I think that's what Premier Ford was really alluding to.
He has been, well, what do we say? He said the other day this, well, you know what? Let's let him say it. Sheldon, we're right below Chapter 3 there. Let's roll that clip from Premier Ford.
I found his comments unfair. I found them insulting. It's like a family member stabbing you right in the heart. Just a reminder to the American people, yes, it will hurt Canada. Yes, it will hurt Ontario, but it will hurt Americans. It will hurt their economy when 9 million Americans don't wake up to produce products. I want to emphasize, to compare us to Mexico is the most insulting thing I've ever heard from our friends and closest allies, the United States of America.
Look, we've known enough politicians over the years to know when they're putting on a show. That guy's not putting on a show. Giles, he is heartbroken that his friend, Donald Trump, is screwing him over this way.
I don't know about his friend, but I certainly say that he's heartbroken.
His political soulmate.
Well, I don't think it's that as much as I think it's that the United States, where he has worked, right? He ran a company in Chicago for many years and believed the Americans to be our close friends. During COVID, and I worked closely with him during that period, he was extremely upset at the way we were treated by the U.S. during COVID. Ford was, because we were denied access to PPEs, ventilators, and a whole bunch of other stuff. And I think he's seeing the same thing again. So he believes in the relationship. He believes in an integrated economy. And, and frankly, we've been at this a lot longer than the Mexicans have in terms of that trade relationship, going back, for example, to the Auto Pact in 1965. So to be treated the same way, what he's saying is, I think he regards it as an insult. And I don't think he's wrong.
What'd you make of the Premier's comments?
Like I said earlier, I think to me, this has been the position Canada has always had on Mexico. Canadians have a sense of ourselves as being what I call either the senior-junior partner in the North American relationship or the junior-senior partner, whichever way you want to do it. When you work in Washington and you work in New York, as I have, Americans don't really see that relationship that way. And I don't know, you look at when the FTA was originally signed by Brian Mulroney, we were their most important trading relationship. Now, depending on what day of the week it is, it's either China or Mexico. In terms of the investment relationship, those sort of parts coming through are really important for them as well. So yes, we are important. In the 80s, coming after the oil price shocks, our oil and gas and guaranteed access to our oil and gas was the singular American priority. That's not their singular American priority now. They're a net exporter of oil and gas. So I think Canada has to sort of adjust to where we are in the world now, as opposed to where we think we are in the world now.
I got another clip I want to show you, okay?
Okay.
Last week, we had Lloyd Axworthy come in here, the former foreign minister
yes.
from many years ago. He's just got his memoirs out right now. He's about to turn 85 years old.
Goodness.
We talked about this. Here's what he had to say. Sheldon, if you would.
There are some very deep economic issues. I wish to hell some of these premiers would shut up for a while and stop talking about kicking Mexico out. You need Mexico.
That's Doug Ford's position.
Yeah, Doug Ford's position, and Smith, and he's out there bragging, all the premiers. Look, if you take Mexico off the table, you're left one-on-one with the Americans. You want to negotiate one-on-one with Donald Trump, rather than having the two most important trading countries together? Come on, that's bad politics. And secondly, Mexico is becoming an important customer for Canada. But we've got these guys who kind of, I don't know what they do in their provincial capitals. So they sort of put tar paper over the windows or something. There's not much light getting in.
What'd you think of that?
Well, he spoke his mind.
You agree with him, though, don't you?
Well, let's put it this way. I think we're going to be up, the next 4 years are going to be a challenge no matter what. And it really is important that we try and stick together. And I think, as Giles mentioned earlier, for example, we need to approach the Americans on things that are of interest to them, such as critical minerals, for example. We need to prove that we are, I also agree with Mark, we're not that important. We are not the most important trading relationship anymore. So what leverage do we have? Very little. So we need to take every resource that we have and pour it into this relationship because it is still the most important relationship for us.
Let me be a little less myopic just for a second here. We know how Canada, Mark, has responded to this. Justin Trudeau went down to Mar-a-Lago. He brought a cabinet minister with him, Dominic LeBlanc. Who else did he bring? Oh, he brought Katie Telford as chief of staff. We know what the premiers are doing in terms of their full court press. We have, I mean, I'm sure Mexico has had a response. We're not as aware of it because obviously we don't care as much. But how have they reacted?
Well, Mexico has a new president, the first woman president, I guess, a leader. It's not Kim Campbell, so I apologize to her. So she's new. She's taking over from her predecessor, her political mentor. She's got an agenda that looks very much like sticking with his agenda, her predecessor's agenda, which is very activist, very contested by foreign investors. And her response to Trump was really tough. It was not like, I'm going to cave. It was actually a tougher response than AMLO, her predecessor, made. So but then they had a phone call, and Trump was charming, and then, as he always does, said, well, this is what we agreed. And then she said, no, it's not what we agreed. So that's always what you're going to get with Trump. So we'll watch that relationship. I mean, the reality of the Mexicans have something really important, and that's the ability to turn on and off a spigot of people coming across the border. And yes, Donald Trump can threaten to use the army and to do things that look very draconian. I don't think he really wants to do that. So, and if he has to, and back to the corner, I think he would. But I think if he could avoid it, he would prefer to do that because it'll look ugly. And Mexicans, all they have to do is say, really? Okay, here they come. And that's something we, at least to this point, don't have.
Okay.
We can make.
Giles, I'm going to get myopic again. We don't know when any of this is going to happen or what's going to happen or what the deadlines are or timetables and so on. We do know at some point in the next year, we're going to have an election in this country, and there's every possibility we could get a new prime minister. Do we have any reason to believe that Pierre Poilievre would prosecute this file any differently from Justin Trudeau?
Well, I think probably, I don't know whether we know how he would prosecute the file, but we do know that he would be a different, he would be a newcomer, a new prime minister. I think to the degree that that maybe we have a prime minister who's been in power for now quite a long time, 9 years, and is not as popular as he once was. As all politicians eventually, wear out their welcome. I think the Americans would probably be looking at a new prime minister with a fresh mandate a little differently than a prime minister who's been around a long time. And this administration, obviously, while I think the prime minister's done pretty well with them over the past, I think there's always a question of whether there isn't some antipathy there for ideological reasons or other reasons that may make it more difficult to do a deal. But having said that, I think the real issue is, as Deanna said, and as Mark is saying, I think it's really we have to do some things that are in our interest and in the U.S. interest in order to try to clear this up. Remember, the Americans are, I hear Lloyd Axworthy, and I did work closely with Lloyd Axworthy a number of years ago. I have a high regard for him. But I think the reality is the United States is our biggest customer. We need to treat them like our biggest customer. Mexico is a customer, but as I said, they have a $3 billion surplus. We sell like $600 million to them. They sell $3 billion back to us, more than that. So actually, the big customer that we have to pay attention to, and frankly, all of our investment relies on, and our standard of living, is really our relationship with the United States.
My last minute here goes to Mark. Since the current Prime Minister's father was in power, we have been talking about diversifying our trading partners and not relying so much on the U.S. as we are now for 77% or whatever it is of our trading relationship. Now would be a good time to actually do that, wouldn't it?
It is a great idea, but geography is our curse, and it's also the thing that benefits us the most, right? Every other country in the world would trade anything to be where Canada is located. And if you go anywhere else in the world, the idea that Canadians even question that. It makes them think, are you crazy? Australia would love to be where Canada is today. It's trying very hard to be Canada, and they're not where Canada is today geographically.
Despite five and a half decades of effort, it's just not on.
It's hard to do, but I think there at the margins are things to do. I think it's a whole other show for Steve. I think the way we approach it, I think is wrong. Filling up planes full of dual Canadian citizens and going off to their ancestral homelands, I think is idiotic. I don't think you're going to expand trade if 5% of the Canadian population can trade with their ancestral home.
You're right. That is another show. We'll get you back for that other show. That's Mark Warner, the Canadian and American trade lawyer with Ma Law. I also want to thank on the other side of the table Giles Gerson, President, CEO of the Toronto Region Board of Trade. Deanna Horton, Distinguished Fellow at U of T's Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Great discussion, everybody. Thanks for coming in to Yonge and Eglinton today.
Thanks.
Thank you, Steve.
Youth unemployment in Canada has reached 14.5%, the highest in more than a decade. Experts are citing consequences such as worsening mental health, higher rates of crime, and social unrest. The youth population actually outnumbers the older generations. So how are we going to employ the next generation? Let's ask. On Manhattan Island in New York City, Brett House, professor of economics at the Columbia Business School. And with us here in studio, Farah Mohammed, CEO of the King's Trust Canada, and Nation Chung, Vice President of Community Impact and Mobilization at United Way Greater Toronto. And it's lovely to have you two here in our studio with us. Brett, great to have you on the line from New York City. And let's just start with some stats here. Farah, these are your stats, Deloitte and the King's Trust Canada. Sheldon, if you would, bring these up, and I'll kind of read them out for those listening on podcast who can't see. Here we go. These are the economic and social costs of youth unemployment in Canada. Some big takeaways here. 14.1% of all workers in the country are 15 to 24 years of age. 14%. 1 in 4 of all unemployed workers are under the age of 25. More than 14% of youth aged 15 to 24 are unemployed, as we suggested in the intro. 850,000 youth aged 15 to 29 are neither employed nor engaged in education and training. And I don't think we have to use our imaginations too much to consider what that portends. Farah, your initial reaction to those numbers?
Well, look, it's jarring. It's jarring if you think about these young people, if you think about the consequences of it. And so we have to sort of step back and say, this is not a new thing. I know we were speaking in the green room. This is something that's been going on. And the problem now is that we have people who are going to retire, young people who are not in the system. So how are they meant to advance? That's why we commissioned this report, to have a really good data set, because people pay attention to numbers, and to wake people up and say, look, we've got to galvanize some action around this.
You're on the front lines. You're in the community. You see this. Does this jibe with what you're seeing?
Absolutely. Steve, we've been seeing this since we launched our Youth Success Strategy in 2014. And we did research to understand all the barriers that a number of young people across the GTA have been facing. And in 2014, we were starting to hear the despondence amongst young people who are graduating from post-secondary and wondering, what am I going to do with this degree? There's no job market for me to enter. So these are young folks who followed all the rules, who entered into the education system, who went through post-secondary education and came out with certification, a degree that was not applicable in the job market. And so there was, at that time, an early sign, there's a misalignment between the needs of employers and what individuals are graduating with in the post-secondary institutions.
Let's get some historical perspective then from Brett. Brett, how did we get here?
Well, to give that perspective, it's worth breaking the numbers down a little bit and looking at how they're defined. The unemployment rate is the share of young people who are in the labor market, are looking for a job and can't find one. And that is, as you noted, a rate that has crept up to the highest level that we've seen in a decade. But it is worth noting it has been much higher at various points in the past. So the shakeout from the pandemic is having an effect on young people looking for work, but we are not in unprecedented territory. The other thing to look at is participation rates, which weren't in those numbers that you put up earlier. Those are the share of people within the 15 to 24-year-old age group who are actually engaged in the labor market, either employed or unemployed and looking. And those rates remain lower than they've been in about 4 decades. They've crept back up to where they were pre-pandemic, but are still not quite there. And we see a persistent imbalance between young men and young women, where young men, both here and in many Western economies, are participating in the labor market to a lower extent or lower rate than their female counterparts. And that's what's reflected in that number of 800 or so thousand young people who are neither in school nor looking for work nor in jobs. Those are the people I'm most concerned about.
Okay, let me get you to follow up on that, because I think I'm hearing two things, Brad. On the one hand, you're saying our labor participation rates are not where they need to be. I also hear you saying the unemployment rate is stubbornly high, but I also hear you saying it's been worse in the past. So put it in perspective for us. How concerning is all of this to you?
I think it's deeply concerning in that we have seen that unemployment rate progressively creep up since 2020, the heart of the pandemic. And that reflects in part what have been a couple tough summers for students looking for work. It also reflects changes in the economy as a result of the pandemic. And we know that young people are typically employed in more precarious sectors, smaller businesses, and in the service sector, all of which took it on the nose during the pandemic. So there's some structural issues underlying these numbers that are not going to be solved quickly and require our attention.
And we'll figure out what attention is required as we still set this up. Farah, what kinds of jobs are young people looking for today that they're having trouble finding?
So let's begin with recent graduates. You know, as you said, they've done the work. They come out, they're looking for these jobs, and they can't get jobs in entry-level positions. These are the ones that start them up for success. The reason they can't get them is, one, there's more competition. Two, we're having employers ask for things that are a little bit unreasonable. For an entry-level position, do you really need 3 years of experience if you can't get the experience? Number one. Do you really need to get a graduate degree? Should you be bilingual? All of these things are barriers that are being put in front of young people. I don't know about you, but my first job was shredding paper and photocopying. It taught me all types of things, resilience because I needed to show up on time, communications, all these different skill sets that young people are not going to get. So they're not finding jobs in part because of the structure, you're quite right, and in part because we're just putting too many barriers in front of them.
Nation, you mentioned that the United Way has been on this for a decade. Have you made any progress?
Well, we set out to reach 10,000 young people in 2014. We've exceeded that with reaching the needs of over 11,000 young people. And we've learned a lot along the way. For some of those young people who do face a number of barriers and are not finding the same success rates in the education system, there's a necessary wraparound support system for those young people. And those wraparound supports are provided by a network of community service organizations across the GTA that are focused on the needs of communities, and those are our partners on the ground. So wraparound supports, mental health, cognitive behavioral therapy we saw that making a significant difference in the first year of our program as we were assessing the data and seeing who's finding the early success. And the programs that had that wraparound supports and understood anything from childcare, transportation supports, emotional well-being supports, and in some programs, cognitive behavioral therapy, we were starting to see a different outcome amongst those programs.
I don't want to take anything away from the good work that you are doing, but 11,000 on a base of 850,000 people who need it means clearly there's a lot more to be done.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
What do we need to do?
So I think there's a couple of things that we've been talking about in the sector for quite some time. We need to start to look at broader adoption of micro-credentials, of recognizing young people who have experiential learning that complements the formal education, but brings things like leadership skills, great communication skills. If an individual is working at a summer camp or a seasonal job, that employers are able to track and able to actually document what skill sets and competencies are these young people building, and then it's recognized more broadly across their employment journey. So we've been talking about that micro-credential and that portable credit, passport credit or recognition amongst employers as one of the solutions. I think the investment from all levels of government in summer job programs and employer supports are a foundation that needs to stay in place to continue to promote employers providing those early opportunities for young people to build the skills that you and I depended on. I started out in Pizza Nova, went on to Harvey's, and then I started shredding paper at Fasken, Campbell and Godfrey when it was Fasken, Campbell and Godfrey.
I'm starting to wonder about you two, both being in shredding businesses.
Yeah.
Are you in some kind of secretive cult here or something?
We're not going to discuss it.
No, okay. Well, let me go to Brett on this then. That's certainly one aspect of the solution that Nation has brought to our attention. I'm going to ask about temporary foreign workers. You know, those numbers have been high in recent years, and I guess people are going to be wondering whether they are taking, quote unquote, taking jobs away from made-in-Canada youth who might want those jobs. What do the numbers say on that?
Well, I do want to open by underscoring that immigration has been a massive net positive for Canada and continues to be, even with some of the concerns about the rapid growth that we had in inflows over the last few years. Temporary foreign workers are a distinct class of folks coming into the country. They're here on multi-year or shorter-term visas, and they're typically brought in to fill labor market needs in specific sectors. And it is worth underscoring that over most of the last decade, the sectors that have been the biggest beneficiaries of temporary foreign workers are some of the areas that are typically targets for young people seeking entry-level work. Restaurants, resorts, hotels, meatpacking, typically low-skilled jobs that do not require the credentials that we've just discussed and are an entryway into the workforce. Those inflows of temporary foreign workers into those sectors were driven by requests by businesses in those areas. And I think it does raise a question about why we are bringing in people into a low-skill, low-credential part of the workforce where young people could fill those jobs who are here in Canada. The question is, will employers be willing to pay the wages that are required to bring in local hires rather than the foreign workers they relied on in the past?
Well, that's one of the good
questions. Or will they
questions.
move to automation?
Right. That's one of the good questions. The other question, and Farah, I don't know if this is empirically provable evidence, but it's certainly anecdotal information that we get from time to time, which is made-in-Canada kids won't do a lot of the harder jobs that temporary foreign workers are brought in by businesses to do. What can you tell us about that?
You know, there's always a percentage of people who fall into that category. The people that we meet, they're high potential, they want to work, and they will do those jobs. I want to come back to just one thing about credentials. You're absolutely right. We need to do this. We have created a skills academy with Humber College that says, look, all the employers are saying, you want to see this? Great. We put it into an academy. They're going to get credentialized. If employers are saying to us, we need to see this, and we're providing it, then it's up to the employers, I would say, to say, okay, let's take a different mindset. Let's think about how we hire. Let's think about what we're looking for. And the point about not paying them well, you know, it is expensive to live in Toronto or anywhere in this country now. So we need to also really be honest about why are we employing people outside of the country versus inside the country?
Well, would you bump the minimum wage to $25 an hour?
I'd bump it up for sure.
Yeah.
I would bump it up. But we also have to be, mindful of what that means for businesses. Everything is cyclical. You don't have young people working. There's going to be a drain in terms of the people who are able to pay Social Security later in the years. You've got a retiring population. You've got young people who are saying, I want to work, I went to school, I want to buy a house, I want to go on this great vacation, whatever the case may be. And the entire cycle's not working. And that is the bigger problem.
Nation, you got to help me understand something here. Because the vast majority of my interactions with young people are extremely positive.
Yes.
And I find young people who are smart, ambitious, they want to work, they want to get ahead, et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, the vast majority of stories I hear from employers are they don't show up on time, they want more vacation time, they're a bit lazier than we were back in the day. Would you help me understand which is more accurate here?
I would frame it first, Stephen, saying we're going through a transition from an industrial labor force mindset to a digital labor force mindset. And I think that context is very, very important. I think we have young people who are coming into their adulthood at a peak in which values are changing around rights, work-life balance that perhaps our previous generation that was roll up your sleeves and grind all the way through until your mental health falls apart. that was the value of a particular generation. And young people are now, with a greater awareness and understanding of health and well-being, of equity rights, are showing up in the workplace with a different mindset. And that can be perceived as challenging or lazy. And I think that's an oversimplification of the complexity of the young people who are entering into the labor force with a greater understanding and expectation of what their workplace has to offer. And I think that the businesses that understand that mindset and are adapting are reaping the benefits of the talent because people will shift. I've heard from public sector workers of young people who have gone through the interview, accepted a position, got their credentials, got their laptop, and in 2 weeks they're like, oh, no, there's something better. It meets, I can work hybrid. As another example, the reality of hybrid working has shifted the labor force expectations of a generation. And so all of that can be oversimplified into wanting too much, demanding too much, or lazy. And I think that it's a distorted perspective on the desire of young people to work, but it's also their expectations of what a workplace looks like.
Brett, I want to put one of the numbers that we used off the top to you because it really is disturbing, this notion that 850,000 young people 15 to 29 are not only not employed, but not engaged in any education or training either. And I want to put to you this study by the Pew Research Center, which found that fewer younger American men have been enrolling in college over the past decade, and men who are not college educated are leaving the workforce at higher rates than men who are. Can you give us some better understanding of why this trend is happening? Because as everybody knows, the more education you get, the better a job you're going to get. It's just one of the givens in this world. More education, better job. So why is this happening?
And you see your point about more education leading to better labor market outcomes in the data. Unemployment rates for young people are always endurably higher for people who have not or just finished high school. And with more tertiary education, those unemployment rates go down. Why are we seeing lower participation rates among young men? I should clarify that is not just a phenomenon in the United States or Canada, but it is one, as I mentioned, across a number of Western economies. And that's happened as participation rates for young women have consistently gone up over the last 40 or 50 years. It is probably a byproduct of technological change and globalization, where some of the trade, industrial, and mechanical jobs that required just a high school education are being either eliminated by automation or trade with other countries, or are being shifted into other regions and sectors that require mobility and that mean that getting those jobs requires a bit more of an investment, and some of that mismatch between where people are, which skills they have, and where the jobs are has grown, notwithstanding the fact that we have more online job postings, Indeed, LinkedIn, and other ways to connect people to the right positions. It is still getting harder to do so. We are also seeing a mismatch in some cases between the kind of skills training that people are getting in vocational schools and colleges and the shifting demands of labor markets. So the need for educational institutions to keep up with those shifts has never been greater.
And Brett, I'm going to do this follow-up with you because you are actually in Donald Trump's home state right now of New York. We know the gender gap on voting, right? There was a bromance out there between young men, well, men in general, and Donald Trump. I think a 13-point gap, men over women on economic issues as it related to their votes for Trump. Do men today, and young men in particular, really think Donald Trump is going to solve their economic dilemma issues?
I should clarify, Donald Trump has decamped to Florida, which is a lower tax state, and has done so in order to reduce his tax burden, amongst other things. The lessons from the U.S. November 5th election are still being drawn out and learned. But for macroeconomists, I think one big set of numbers to reflect on is that Barack Obama was reelected in 2012 with a U.S. unemployment rate at 7.9%. but inflation was only around 1.8%, and price levels had increased by only 8% over the 4 years of his first term. Contrast to the last 4 years. Prices have gone up by 22%, and wages haven't entirely kept up with that in many parts of the economy. But unemployment is down at 4.1%, just off a historic low last year at 3.4%. The Biden-Harris team thought they would be rewarded for getting more people back to work despite the increase in prices. And the lesson I take from this election versus 2012 is that the people who vote don't care so much about whether some people at the margins have got jobs or not. They care about one big data point they see every day, and that's the cost of living when they go to the pump, into the grocery store, or into a restaurant to pick up lunch. And with that 22% increase in prices, I think folks across the board felt that they were far worse off than the unemployment rate implied that the economy is doing as a whole.
That's a very insightful point. I've heard that. That is really perhaps the number one takeaway from the last election for president of the United States. Farah, let me ask you about this. We've talked about male participation rates in the workplace. Women are participating more in the workplace now. The numbers have been going inexorably in that direction for the last 50 years or so. The participation rate gap between men and women is shrinking. Do we have every expectation that that will continue going forward?
Look, I'm a big believer in trends. I think that question is a tough one. I think a lot of things depend on whether or not we're creating the atmosphere for women to move ahead. Progress is a big thing, incentives to stay in. I have seen for sure a trend where it goes up. I've also seen women walk out of the workforce because they're not getting the supports that they need. Childcare is a very big one. If you're meant to be a mom and somebody who's working, if you don't create an atmosphere where they can do both, they will leave. And so that's the one thing I would say we need to look out for.
Childcare, we're told, has never been better in this country.
Not for everyone.
Not for everyone, to be sure, but we certainly have more attention to childcare issues by federal and provincial governments across the country than perhaps ever before.
I agree. But it needs to be equal to the demand. So right now we have a really big divide, I would argue, between people who want it, people who can get it. And so it is better, but it's not where it needs to be so that women are not making the choice not to work.
Gotcha. Okay, Nation, let's hit on this. Last few minutes to go here. The metaphor of a ticking time bomb is a bit of a cliche, but the reality is if you've got this many hundreds of thousands of people out there with no jobs and no prospects, that's a huge problem. What are we going to do?
I think at the individual level, the population level, Steve, I think we have, as mentioned before, we've got a concern with growing mental health amongst young people. I think this is not just exclusive, this is not exclusive to young people. We're seeing it in the workplaces that there's a greater demand for mental health supports even amongst adults. I would say that's intense amongst young people. And so we have to be very attentive to the mental health issues that is growing amongst young people and the high suicide ideation rate that has been increasing. At the larger, more structural pieces, as mentioned by Farah earlier, we've got a growing population. We've got a generation that's coming up that doesn't have the access point to build the skill sets, the competencies, and the confidence to support the labor force that's going to be necessary to generate the tax dollars that's supporting an aging population. So we've got a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do, and to be able to understand what needs to happen at all levels of government, across corporate sector and businesses. I know business, especially small and medium businesses, are struggling right now across the GTA. I know the City of Toronto is worried about the downtown core, main streets. So it is a multi-layered strategy that's needed. Government investment. We need to support businesses to stabilize and thrive, because these are the entry points for many of those young people.
Mind you, Brett, I do remember 40 years ago or so, Brian Mulroney campaigning for office on a slogan of, the best social program is a job. Is that still the case in your view?
That's absolutely the case in terms of personal satisfaction, making a contribution to one's own well-being in society. and in terms of people's ability to consume, spend, and invest in themselves. We know that the biggest determinant of all of those things is whether they have gainful employment. And ensuring that they do, I think, is a responsibility not just of government policymakers and NGOs and organizations working in this space, but it needs to be a priority for business, that they are tightly aligned with those organizations and businesses that are doing work to build skills, create smoother paths for transition into the workplace, and retain and develop people. Because as Farah mentioned, one of our biggest problems is that we get diverse parts of the workforce into big institutions and companies, but they tend to leave at the mid-level rank. And so we still have both a pipeline issue and a retention issue.
Farah, in our last minute here, I want you to give people a sense of what kind of future are we looking for, or looking to rather, if we don't get this right?
Well, it's pretty dire. Young people, as we know, will have mental health issues. They'll start to lose interest and trust in institutions, which is a bigger issue. Yes. Corporations will not have the skills that they need. That's a really big issue. How are we going to be productive and competitive? Government will find that they're not getting the revenues that they need to have. This report showed that it was a $5 billion loss over the next 10 years. So for me, we have a young person problem. We have a corporation problem. We have a government problem. And all those things add up to not the kind of Canada I think we want. And that's what's jarring. If this report doesn't wake people up to doing something, then we really need to take a closer look at ourselves.
I guess I would remind people in their 40s, 50s, 60s that if they want their pensions to be there for them, we've got to make sure this generation is employed, because they're the ones who are going to be making pension contributions that are going to keep the system afloat.
Yep,
so
exactly.
Where can people read this report if they want to?
It's on our website, kingstrust.ca. It's front and center, and welcome any comments, anyone who wants to work with us. The door's open.
Good stuff. I want to thank the three of you for coming on to TVO tonight and having a very important and timely discussion. Farah Mohammed, the King's Trust Canada, Nation Chung, VP, Community Impact, United Way, Greater Toronto, Brett House on the line from New York City, Columbia Business School. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.
And that is the agenda for Tuesday, December 3rd, 2024. As we celebrate Giving Tuesday today, we want to share why your support for TVO matters not just to us, but to Ontario's future. We think education and independent journalism are critical to shaping a stronger tomorrow. TVO provides programs that empower Ontarians of all ages to learn, grow, and stay informed. If you're inclined, please visit tvo.org/GivingTuesday. And if you donate before midnight tonight, the Wilson Foundation will match your gift, doubling your impact. So, thank you for considering TVO. Tomorrow on the program, Jeannie Becker, host of the iconic series Fashion Television, joins us for an interview about her new memoir. You won't want to miss that. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.